Hi, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful event today. I'm Samuel Clowes Huneke, and I'm an assistant professor of modern German history here in the Department of History and Art History at George Mason University. I helped organize this event, and I'll be moderating the Q&A session after the conversation. First, I'd like to thank the amazing institutions that have supported this event. It's co-sponsored by the George Mason University Center for Humanities Research, the Mason German program in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, and the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. as part of its Time to Act German Campus Weeks, as you can see from my screen. I would also like to offer my particular thanks to Francine Marks and Natalia Dudnik in the George Mason German program, who make German Week at Mason happen every year. So as you know, this event is a conversation between Michael Rothberg and Alison Landsberg on the topic Holocaust and Postcolonialism, Germany's past and future memory culture. They will be engaging in a number of questions about Germany's memory culture, both its historical evolution and its theoretical ramifications for memory studies. Alison Landsberg is professor of history in the Department of History and Art History here at George Mason. She is the inaugural director of the Center for Humanities Research here. She's an internationally recognized scholar in the field of memory studies. Her first book, Prosthetic Memory, The Transformation of American Remembrance in the Age of Mass Culture, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2004, considers the ways in which individuals are increasingly able to take on memories of events they did not live through. She is interested in the potential of such memories to produce empathy and to become the grounds for progressive politics. Her second book, Engaging the Past, Mass Culture and the Production of Historical Knowledge, also published by Columbia in 2015, explores popular modes of engagement with the past in contemporary mediated society and the ramifications of those modes of engagement for the projects of history and politics. She is currently working on a project entitled Post-Racial America, in which she explores the contemporary eruption of discourse about race on both the political left and right in the context of the post-Obama landscape and the Trump campaign and election. Michael Rothberg is the 1939 Society Samuel Clowes Chair in Holocaust Studies, Professor of English and Comparative Literature, and Chair of the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. His latest book is The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, which was published in 2019 by Stanford University Press in their Cultural Memory in the Present series. Previous books include Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, 2009, Dramatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation in 2000, and co-edited with Neil Levi, The Holocaust, Theoretical Readings in 2003. The 2021 translation of Multidirectional Memory into German led to a national debate about the relationship between the Holocaust and colonialism, which we'll be hearing about today. With Yasmin Yildiz, he is working on a book about Germany called Memory Citizenship, Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance for Fordham University Press. So over the next 30 to 45 minutes, Alison and Michael will converse about the evolution of Germany's memory culture since the end of World War II, how it's intersected with the history of post-war decolonization efforts and postcolonialism, how it has continued to evolve today, and what lessons it might have for us in the United States as well as other countries. Afterwards, we will open the conversation up to questions from the audience. We've disabled the chat feature, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to post your questions. I'll then pose them to Professor Rothberg and Professor Landsberg. In the case of several similar questions, I may group them together. I should finally note that this event is being recorded, as will the Q&A session. And without further ado, over to Alison and Michael.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking my colleague Sam Huneke in the Department of History and Art History, and Francine Marks and Natalia Dudnik in the German program in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages for conceptualizing this event. And I'd like to thank the German Embassy for their generous support. I'd also like to thank Catherine Oline, the Associate Director of the Center for Humanities Research, for all of her help getting this event up today. And finally, I'd like to thank Michael Rothberg, who I've known for over a decade, for joining us today for this conversation.
Thanks, great to be here.
So let's start with a kind of historical overview. How has Germany's Holocaust memory culture evolved since the end of World War II?
Yeah, great question. Let me also start though by thanking you, Alison and Sam, for the invitation, and Catherine and everyone else who helped organize this, including the embassy. It's great to be here talking with Alison, whose work I'm such a big admirer of. So I'm really looking forward to this. How has Germany's Holocaust memory culture evolved? I mean, I think I would start in some ways from the end, or from what's almost the end, and just say that today, of course, German memory culture is considered a kind of model for how a nation can come to terms with its own crimes. And it really is, I think, rightly so admired for that. We're going to talk about some of the complications that I think are also there in that model later, but I think we have to start from that fact that there just aren't that many countries who have grappled so seriously as Germany has with its crimes against humanity. And many countries, including our own, also have such crimes that need to be dealt with, and Germany has done it more explicitly and more thoroughly than most other places. I think, though, that most scholars would also say that that model that we now admire took, in fact, many decades to develop, right? That it wasn't instantly born after the end of the Second World War, and that for many decades, German society tended more to avoid grappling with the Holocaust. And it's really only in, I think, the post-unification period, so post-90s into the early 2000s, where you really get a society-wide consensus, at least about the public significance of the Holocaust and its importance for thinking about German national identity, right? So how did we get there? And I think that process took, in fact, decades to develop, and it wasn't strictly linear. And you know, it's a complicated history. One of the remarkable things about German memory culture of the last, 70, 80 years is just how many different debates and controversies have taken place. They're actually impossible to list altogether. But I think what you see in the early years, though there is, of course, some important stuff happening, like, for example, the agreement to pay reparations in the early 1950s, or in the early 1960s, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, right, which started to put some perpetrators on trial. But I think in the early decades, the consensus is that the specificity of the Holocaust, right, as a genocide of European Jews, was not very central in German consciousness, that in fact, when it came to victimization, there was quite an emphasis on the victimization of non-Jewish Germans themselves. And of course, people had suffered quite a bit in the war and after the war, but this was really, it was German suffering that was much more at the heart of German memory than the Holocaust, as I think today it more often is. So how do we get from that early period to the late period? There were a series of things, including the reparations, the trials, important gestures by, like, for example, Chancellor Willy Brandt going to Warsaw, kneeling down in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Monument in 1970, taking responsibility and, in a sense, publicly atoning for the Holocaust, though he himself had been in the resistance and had been persecuted by the Nazi state. But still, seeing that as a German and as the representative of the German state, he had to take responsibility. But there was also a lot of resistance to that gesture. And it took many more, another couple of decades before that gesture would be recognized in a wide sense as a definitive one for Germany. And you have, I think what's important, a couple of other things I'll just mention up front. You have some important popular culture moments, such as the screening of the Holocaust miniseries in the late 1970s. And then in the 1980s, the development of a kind of grassroots memory culture, a memory culture from below, that Jenny Wustenberg, a scholar in memory studies, has discussed in a really important book on civil society and German memory culture, talking about the history workshop movements and the memorial site movements, where civil society started to act. And I think that's a really important turning point, that then after unification becomes more integrated into the state and becomes at that point a sort of official memory. And if you wanted an icon of that official memory, you would probably go to the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in the center of Berlin, a vast Holocaust memorial, which was much debated, but finally opened in 2005 and is now really, I think, a kind of centerpiece of anyone's visit to Berlin. And it's right there in the middle of the city.
Can I just ask you, I mean, my interest has always been on the role of mass culture and, primarily film and television in intervening in the memorial process in various ways. And it was sort of around those ideas that I developed prosthetic memory. And so I guess I'm wondering, I mean, the 70s seemed like a really important time for a lot of this memory work. And as a kind of like moment of transition, I think that was when, Elie Wiesel sort of famously said, that what do we do? And the commission to start the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. But I'm wondering if you could say something about more about the effect, the implications of the miniseries. Because I think that in many ways, I mean, obviously, there needed to be a kind of public reckoning, with the Holocaust, from a different kind of perspective. And I'm wondering to what extent you see or how you understand the role of that miniseries in this project.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, so what we're talking about is an American-produced television miniseries called The Holocaust. Probably many people are familiar with it. It was screened in the US in 1978 and made a big impact here. I think that's true. And then was screened on German television in 1979. And something like 20 million people watched it, like literally a third of the population is the statistic that comes to mind. So it was a mass event in Germany. And it is I mean, on the one hand, critics, including Elie Wiesel, since you mentioned him, have talked about this series as kind of a trashy television series, right? I mean, Wiesel wrote a scathing editorial about the series when it appeared in the United States, originally published in the New York Times, I believe, where he just said, this is really just a terrible, terrible thing, a corruption really of our knowledge of the Holocaust. And, most critics would agree with that. It's not a particularly well-made cultural product. And yet it functioned as a kind of switching point, I think, in Germany, specifically, where we went from that moment that I described earlier, where the central concern was really German suffering, to, for the first time, a mass German public acknowledging, empathizing with, being moved by a story of Jewish suffering. And so it's actually, I think, a perfect example of your notion of prosthetic memory, where it's precisely through this somewhat lowbrow, middlebrow mass cultural product, historically not very significant, but that has an incredible affective, emotional impact on a mass public. And I think, most scholars of this period would agree that this really was a turning point in Germany. And I don't know how exactly we could establish its agency in transforming the memory culture, but it's certainly true that in the wake of it, things really started to change. That's when you had those grassroots movements really taking off in Germany. So it's, I do think it's a powerful example of the way that cultural production can really shift understanding about historical events in pretty profound ways. It's interesting, of course, that it followed a year after the miniseries Roots, right, which dealt with the history and legacies of slavery in the United States. And so I'm wondering, this is something I think that you, of course, know quite a bit about. So I wonder if you see in the US context, something similar happening to what I just described happening in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great parallel. Obviously, Roots was also, I think, really sort of cheesy in its production. And yet it was, I think, a real cultural touchstone in this country. I mean, it was, he published it, I think, in '76, a year of the bicentennial, a moment when sort of Americans were thinking about the where they were, the legacies of our particular past, and sort of like the viewing statistics that you described for the Holocaust, very similar for Rus. It was a very unusual airing situation. It was in January of 1977, and they played the episodes sort of sequentially on each night. So it was like a week of watching this story unfold. And 61% of all households who were watching primetime television were tuned in. So, I mean, 80 million people watched some part of this series. It was seen in 31,900,000 homes. So it felt to many people like a collective shared event. And I think it really did open a kind of public and mass discussion about enslavement in the US, a topic that was not really spoken about in the public sphere for obvious reasons. I mean, it was a site of shame for African Americans, and also a site of shame for the United States. And this moment, I think, opened the possibility that we could sort of think collectively about that. And as you said, I think the sort of possibilities for empathy were important here as well. I mean, this was a narrative that was constructed from the point of view of an African subject, Kunta Kinte, and viewers were invited to see the world through his eyes and the eyes of his descendants, right? And so this was a very powerful moment for African Americans in this country, and I think and also a powerful moment for white people who were being asked to sort of see themselves, as the oppressors. And I think in a way that was actually constructive. I mean, did this end up having some kind of long-term effect? I mean, I think unfortunately what it led to more was, people pursuing their own genealogical, histories, right? That it provoked a lot of discussion in that regard. But I do think, I mean, if you're to sort of trace really important moments for engaging with the history of enslavement, which I'm really interested in now, I think that we can't ignore the significance of roots in that regard. So I think, and I think it's really interesting to think sort of comparatively between the US and Germany, and hopefully we can get back to that later. But I think one of the sort of central insights of your really important and fascinating book, Multidirectional Memory, was to consider the ways in which postcolonialism and Holocaust memory develop in tandem. So I guess, I mean, it'd be great for us to hear, how you came to this topic. How does this history reshape the way you think about and understand Holocaust memory and regimes of memory more broadly?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, this question of the relationship between the Holocaust and postcolonialism or colonial history and memory is one of the major sources of debate in the recent German discussions that Sam alluded to at the beginning that I'm sure we'll want to talk more about. But it was a topic that I approached many years ago already, first not in a German context, but really primarily in Anglophone and Francophone context, but it has implications for German memory culture as well, which we can get to. It's a book that I actually started working on at the beginning of the 21st century, so it's about 20 years now. And what I noticed at the time was a certain shared understanding of the way that public memory worked, which I found insufficient and even troubling. And it was the idea that I came to call competitive memory. There was a lot of discussion at the time about sort of competition of victims. It's a phrase I don't like much, though it's again had a kind of rebirth in the German context. I think it misdescribes a lot of what's going on. But there was a kind of discourse about competitive memory. And the idea was, and this was around the time when the Holocaust was becoming very prominent indeed in the United States as well as elsewhere. And there was a sense that the prominence of the Holocaust was in fact blocking other histories and memories from articulation in public. And then there was a kind of response to that response, whereby other folks thought, well, or people who were proponents, let's say, of Holocaust memory felt that, well, if we start talking about slavery also, or colonialism also, that's going to relativize or even erase the prominence or the significance of the Holocaust in the public sphere. And so there was a kind of debate going on between these two camps. But for me, they shared a similar logic, and the logic was flawed. It was the logic that I identified with the zero-sum game, right? The idea that if you have one thing, in this case, a memory of a particular history, that you can't have another one simultaneously, that one is taking the space of the other. And it just didn't seem to me that that's how memory works in public. Certainly there's conflict, there is competition, people articulate competitive memories all the time. I don't deny that at all, of course, but this notion that it's one or the other was what really kind of troubled me. And, I think it's interesting to think back to, I don't talk about this in the book, but that moment in the late 70s where you have Roots quickly followed by the Holocaust miniseries, and think about the interaction between those different memories and what was happening there. I ended up going all the way back to the early post-war period and was able to trace a tradition of what I would call multidirectional memory eventually, in which the articulation of Holocaust memory in public took place from the start in relationship to, in what I would call a productive relationship to, memories of slavery, memories of colonialism, and then the actual processes of decolonization that were happening in those early post-war decades, right? So I was trying to bring together these histories that are usually kept apart. And instead of seeing this zero-sum competition, what I found was that they were in some ways feeding off of each other, that there was this productivity to what was happening, where the memory of colonialism, I think initially, and again, the fact of decolonization was driving some of the remembrance of the Holocaust in public. And the remembrance of the Holocaust in public, in turn, was providing kind of venues and possibilities for articulating memories of slavery and colonialism that had otherwise not been so visible and hadn't been so publicly articulated. And if I can give just a particular example of that to make it a little bit more concrete, this was something I learned about in writing a book that I really knew nothing about before. I became interested almost accidentally in the period of the Algerian War of Independence, and particularly how it played out in France. And what I came to see is that people who were either actively supporting the Algerian cause, or in any case opposing colonialism and opposing the French war in Algeria, were articulating their opposition to the war or their support for Algerians in terms that remembered the Holocaust or the Nazi occupation and the Vichy period in France. And that might seem weird at first until you remember that we're talking about a moment only 15 years after, 10 to 15 years after the end of the Second World War. And the fact that many of the people who were doing this had themselves been deported by the Nazis, held in camps, tortured by the Nazis. And what they were seeing in Algerian War era France was they felt an echo of those events. They saw vast camps in which Algerians were being held. They saw racist violence on the streets of Paris. They saw mass torture against Algerians and their supporters. And for them, it was a disturbing echo of what had happened earlier. We might look back, I think rightly so, and say, well, what does, Algeria have to do with the Holocaust in these particular instances? Of course, they're very different kinds of events. Colonization, genocide are not the same. And yet they were perceived as similar enough that a certain emergent Holocaust memory was stimulated at that time, right? At the same moment that people were struggling to against state censorship and state violence, to speak out also and testify about what was happening in Algeria. So I guess my point there, what I describe as multidirectional memory, is precisely the way that these different memories were influencing each other, that they were developing in tandem. And so what I was proposing, not just a specific case study about the Holocaust, but also a rethinking of how we think about collective public memory. And that we move across boundaries of what we think are separate histories, and we look for these moments of productive interaction. And in fact, though I think you work on these events and you're always somewhat in your own world, and then you come out of it and you realize, well, I'm not the only one who is doing this sort of thing. I think that moment in the early 2000s was a moment when approaches to memory were changing quite in important ways. And your work, Alison, was of course part of that too. And I think there's some real similarities between what I was trying to do in multidirectional memory and what you were doing in a more American specific context, which is also one that concerns me, in prosthetic memory, and other colleagues of ours also doing a kind of more transcultural, transnational turn in approaches to memory.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I would just say another one of my favorite moments from multidirectional memory is when you talk about Du Bois at the Warsaw Ghetto, right? And how it helped him to understand the color line, which is kind of like amazing, really, to contemplate. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really, I think that we were both involved in, I think, this kind of what we might think of as a second wave of memory studies. The first wave was kind of focused on memory as cited, institutionalized in memorials and museums and mnemonic practices, and always kind of in the service of the nation. And I think that, you know, your work and the work of so many others, Anne Rigney, Chiara De Cesari, Aleida Osman, Mariana Hirsch, Astrid Earle, Anna Redding, Daniel Snyder and Levy, among others, were very much invested in the idea that memory needs to be thought of as moving across national boundaries, as transcultural, as transnational, as transmedial. And one of the things that I was really interested in when I was developing the idea of prosthetic memory was the way in which you know, it might be possible for people to take on memories of events that they didn't actually live through. And I think that, you know, I guess, I mean, one of the things that I'd like to, maybe we can come back to this later, to thinking about the role of like Holocaust memory in the US, but I was interested in sort of thinking through the ramifications of that. And I was also interested in thinking about the extent to which it was really possible for a kind of oversaturated memory field around the Holocaust might actually produce a kind of vocabulary with which Americans might confront their own, you know, genocidal or atrocious sort of violence in the past. But, you know, maybe we can get to that later. I did want to sort of, you know, say that obviously, you know, your work has been well known and incredibly influential in the field of memory studies. And we've been talking about multi-directional memory for like a decade. And yet the recent translation of this book into German has introduced it to a new audience. And I'd be interested to hear what you make of this reception in Germany and the kind of debates that it's produced.
Sure. Yeah, it's been a strange year. I can tell you that from the start. My book appeared in multidirectional memory, appeared in Germany in February of this year. So 12 years, almost 12 years after it was initially published in English. And certainly in those intervening 12 years, people in Germany have, scholars in Germany at least have read it. Some of them certainly have, and it's been cited. And even a couple of pieces had been translated. So it didn't come out of the blue, but it kind of appeared, I think, in a moment that was already primed for a certain amount of controversy. And I think it contributed to that. And in fact, these controversies continue up to today. And the controversies, to give to in the shortest terms, have to do precisely with the question of the uniqueness or comparability of the Holocaust. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. And I do think that what we're seeing in the last few years, and again, the context into which the book has entered in Germany, signals for me a kind of shift in German memory culture. Right? I talked earlier about the way in the post-unification period, a certain, the Holocaust really became a prominent central pillar of German identity, and this German model of coming to terms with the past became quite widespread and admired. But I start to have the sense, and I'm not alone in that, I think, that in the last decade or so, things have taken a bit of a turn. And that aspects of that memory culture, which have been so productive, are now starting to show a somewhat darker side. And I think that emerges in some of these debates. And the reasons for that are pretty complicated. I certainly don't have all the answers to it, but I'll try to at least sketch a few factors maybe that are playing into it. But I'll say that what we've seen in the last 18 months or so, almost exactly the time of the pandemic, has been a cycle of debates that turn on, among other things, again, this question of the Holocaust uniqueness. And the first kind of indication I had that there was something going on was a controversy that erupted over the Cameroonian, South Africa-based historian and theorist Achille Mbembe, probably the most prominent intellectual from the African continent working today, and one of the most prominent intellectuals in the world, period, who was disinvited from a cultural festival in Germany where he'd previously spoken many times and has received awards and all sorts of things, because a politician cherry-picked quotations from some of his work to try to, and accused him of Holocaust relativization and anti-Semitism, in particular because of some of the ways that Israel was evoked in his work and put into relation with, say, apartheid South Africa. Apartheid and the Holocaust were in some ways being brought together. Again, these are minor moments in his work. It's not really, the question of the Holocaust or anti-Semitism is not really at the center of his work at all, but it was really kind of cherry-picked and turned into this controversy. And I got myself mixed up a little bit in that, and maybe through that started to become a little bit more known in Germany. So when my book appeared, people were ready to criticize it, let's say. And it hasn't been only criticism either. I think there are also a lot of people who've precisely been looking for a kind of multi-directional framework to think about memory in a German context. Because while the Holocaust is unquestionably central in German memory culture, it's not the only thing that is important there or should be important there. There's a history of German colonialism. There is a long history of migration from all different parts of the world, and most recently, post-2015, the kind of refugee flows that we've seen from Syria, from Afghanistan, places like that. There's a lot of other stuff. Germany has become a much more multicultural country. And so how do you develop a memory culture for a multicultural society, right? In which, of course, the Holocaust is going to remain prominent, but it seems to me at least inevitable that it's going to have to enter into dialogue with other histories, with other experiences, right? Not everyone fits the normative model of, descendant of non-Jewish Germans who were Nazis or were, in some ways complicit or benefiting from the Nazi past. People have migrated into that experience. And that's a complicated question, how to think of all of that. So the debates have been heated, often quite aggressive. It's been a kind of shock to me because, when my books appeared in France and Poland, they didn't make a lot of waves as far as I could see. They've been, as you said, generously, the book has been widely taken up in memory studies, and it doesn't mean that everyone agrees with it. Of course, there's criticism of all sorts, and that's legitimate, but I wouldn't say it was controversial particularly. But as it entered into the German public sphere, it became very controversial because I was allegedly relativizing the importance of the Holocaust. And that's really, I think, not at all a good description of what I do. I'm interested in thinking relationally about the Holocaust, and particularly relationally about Holocaust memory, right? That's what my book is really about. It's not the history of the Holocaust, it's how has the Holocaust been remembered in relationship to these other histories? And to me, that's an important message that could be useful even in a German context. And again, certainly some people think that, but it's also been aggressively criticized as if I were denying, the uniqueness of the Holocaust, as if I were denying the gravity and importance of the Holocaust, which is really not at all, what I'm trying to do.
Can I ask, what do you see as the sort of work that's being done in Germany by the insistence on the uniqueness of the Holocaust? I mean, why is this something that needs to be sort of clung to so dearly?
Right. I think it's complicated, and I think there are a lot of different factors at play. Susan Neiman, who's a philosopher and the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam in Germany, who I think we'll come back to later because she's really written a very important book on the relationship between German and American memory cultures. She recently said at a conference that she thought a lot of what was happening had to do with the recent electoral rise of the far right, right? So in 2017, a party called the Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, a far-right party was elected into the German parliament. So this is the first time since the Nazi period that a far-right party has made it into the parliament. And there is indeed, I think, again, rightfully, a lot of anxiety about the fact that they have become as powerful as they have become. Obviously a minority party, but still with, they were just re-elected to parliament for the second time, which gives them certain privileges, actually, in terms of funding and such. So it's a dangerous situation, and people associated with the AfD have consistently trivialized and relativized the Holocaust. That's absolutely true and absolutely to be opposed. And so I think there's a kind of heightened anxiety, perhaps partly because of the far right, but it starts to play out in other contexts. And the ones that interest me and where I think this model of uniqueness starts to become problematic are, for example, the coming to terms with the colonial past that I mentioned. And that has different dimensions that are being actively debated right now in Germany. So you have, for example, the fact that in the early 20th century, what's called the first genocide of the 20th century took place, and that was the German genocide of the Herero and Nama in what was then German Southwest Africa and is today's Namibia, right? So the first genocide of the century was a German genocide. And so the question becomes, has this been adequately dealt with? This is being negotiated at the highest levels of state politics, but also in civil society. And a kind of question then about what that might or might not have to do with the Holocaust. That's become a very controversial question. I'm not a historian of this period or really a historian at all. So I think that's something that historians are actively debating. And there's some skepticism about the thesis that there's a kind of direct line from the genocide in Southwest Africa to the Holocaust. And that's fine, but I would tend to agree with my colleague Jürgen Simmerer that there have to be some connections here, that if you commit a genocide in one place and then 40 years later, 35 years later, it happens again, there have to be some sorts of, he calls them continuities. I would say at least some sort of relationality between those different events. So that's something that's very controversially being debated. In Germany, like in other places, there's this question of looted artworks, the Benin bronzes in museums. What do you do? What kind of restitution is necessary? There is the experience among people of color in Germany of everyday racism, which is seen as one of the legacies of colonialism. And so I think part of what's at stake, and I could say more about how this links up with larger questions of migration. I think part of what's at stake is the very definition of who counts as German, what counts as German, who has a kind of interpretive authority to make sense of and to come to terms with the German past in all its multiplicity. And I think that there's a sense among, again, especially among people of color, but not only that, there's a kind of hardening of German identity that takes place around this insistence on the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And what many other people are working toward, including a lot of people throughout civil society, in museums and cultural institutions, is a kind of opening up of German memory culture, which is necessary to confront this much more diverse population. And to acknowledge that there are aspects of German history that have not received the same kind of adequate coming to terms as the Holocaust has. Again, rightly so, but that shouldn't prevent the same kind of serious engagement with, again, say the Herero and Nama genocide, other forms of colonial violence, or let's say everyday racism since unification, right, which has taken the lives of many, many people throughout West and East Germany.
Yeah, I think that, and I'm interested in this idea of sort of the fixedness of the narrative, right? And I think that, I think that I see sort of parallels in the sort of US context, not so much around the uniqueness of the Holocaust anymore, although that's obviously still debated here. But I think that, what we have in the United States is a kind of fixedness of the narrative of racial progress, right? And this is one of the things that I have been really interested in my work. And that has been to, to think about how it's possible to challenge a kind of what seems like an intractable narrative that is sort of really central to the national story. Like in the same way that the uniqueness of the Holocaust has become really central to the story that Germany tells about itself, because it's a story of its, taking responsibility, right? And that's sort of like what's so powerful, I think, about the maintaining that narrative of the Holocaust, because sort of the Germans did right in the way that they sort of memorialized it, but that, as you sort of rightly point out, that blocks and prevents interrogation of other sort of acts of colonial violence and mistreatment of immigrants and all of this. But so what I see, what I've been working on in the US context is really about what I see here as an attempt to disrupt the narrative of progress. I mean, because this narrative of progress that we have here that's become so fixed relies on a particular temporalization that locates racialized violence, in the past as over and done. And in fact, like the very act of history writing is in some ways complicit with this temporalization, because it's sort of insisting on this idea of a break between the past and present. And so, really wonderful scholars like Saidiya Hartman, who's described the afterlives of slavery, and Christina Sharp, who has written about the wake of slavery, are both interested in, I think, theorizing a temporal schema that's different from this linear one that is premised on progress. So in the project that I'm working on right now, on post-racial America, I point to some indications that maybe there have been some challenges to this seemingly intractable narrative of progress. And I think it's being challenged on a number of popular fronts. And I actually would say that your work, I mean, the fact that your work is creating this incredible debate is really, I think, potentially productive. So even if it's not, enjoyable to live through, I think that, it's doing really important work, I think, and speaking to a really large audience. So, I mean, what I see happening here is also, I think, happening kind of on a large, more public scale. So like on the one hand, I'd point to the work of people like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Ava DuVernay's The 13th, and of course, the New York Times 1619 project that was undertaken by Nicole Hannah-Jones and others on the one hand. And on the other hand, the really, significant, powerful mobilizing work of Black Lives Matter, all of that work sort of suggesting that the past is not over and done with, right? That we are living right now with this racial violence continuing into the present. But so my work has really been focusing on popular sites where I see this happening: Mass Culture, the Legacy Museum, the films like Get Out, the television show Watchmen. Basically, I think that all of these mass cultural texts are also pointing or using or relying on a different temporal schema, one that's not sort of a linear historicist narrative progress, but something more akin to like what, and this is what I've been trying to develop in my work, what Walter Benjamin calls a dialectical image, where like this, a traumatic moment of the past flashes up in a moment of danger, and it's brought into contact with the present in order to disrupt the present, to radically reframe the present. And this kind of dynamic image between the past and present that the dialectical image supposes rejects this idea of progress, right? And says that we are still living in a kind of catastrophe and need to sort of reframe the present. So, I mean, I guess all of this is to just sort of say that I think that that a problem that I see and a problem that you see of sort of around the fixity of particular narratives are at play in both contexts, albeit sort of in different kinds of ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating. I can't wait to read more of the work that you're doing now. I mean, I think you're right. On the one hand, the German and American contexts are so different from each other in all sorts of ways, despite sharing many common references and, whether popular cultural or what have you. But I think there may be something to that idea of one of the problems being a kind of narrative of progress or overcoming. And I think that, again, the German one is an ironic form of that because it's premised on continually remembering and returning to the past in a certain sense and claiming responsibility for the Holocaust. But there is a sense, and I'm certainly not the first person to say it at all, that there a certain kind of pride can develop in that sort of memory culture that we've dealt with our problems, we've overcome them, and now we need to continue to remember, but we've sort of figured it out, right? And I think what I would say is in the last few years in Germany, and I think also productively in the United States, we've realized that no, we haven't figured it out. Not that anyone here would ever really could sincerely believe that we had, but I think it's really clear that there are various things that are troubling the present. And that's become even more clear in the last couple of years. But anyone who is paying attention would know that that was true before as well. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. And for me, a short pitch for a more recent book than Multidirectional Memory was this book I wrote called The Implicated Subject, which is precisely about how we grapple with these questions of legacies over time and what it means to inherit or to benefit from histories that we didn't participate in directly, right? So my family immigrated to the United States early in the 20th century. We weren't here during the period of slavery. We weren't here for the initial conquest, right, of indigenous land, and yet we immigrated into it. We benefited from it by virtue of our whiteness, among other things. And so we are implicated in that history. And I think that sense of implication of political and historical responsibility, for me at least, is an important way of, again, troubling those narratives of progress or overcoming. And I think in the German context, that's partly, what's going on. There's on the one hand, a strong sense of historical responsibility for the Holocaust, but sometimes I think less inclination to see how you're implicated in other forms of racial violence and ongoing racialization, right? And so it's almost as if racism happened, it was the Holocaust, that's over and done with. Don't bring up these other things, they're not the Holocaust, and therefore, they don't trouble us in the same way. So yeah, I think there's some interesting parallels as well as differences.
Well, I think that's really great. And maybe this is a good moment to open it up to the audience to see if there are questions for you or for us about any of what we've said. But I've enjoyed this a lot. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, both Alison and Michael. This was a really fascinating conversation, really wonderful to watch and listen to. So just for the audience, a quick reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A box down below, and I'll forward them on to our two discussants. This is still being recorded, so if you don't want your name attached to a question, just post it anonymously. And so let's see. One question from Luza Müller. When and how does the culture and work of memory entangle with shame? How can that relationship be managed so that it produces positive mobilization?
That's a really interesting question, and maybe Alison will want to weigh in on that too. Alison talked, earlier in, I think, the discussion of roots about the way that shame might be at play, perhaps both for African-American and white Americans in relationship to a history like slavery. And I think it's, I think there's a similar discussion to be had probably in the German context as well. And again, this in some ways gets to work that I've done since Multidirectional Memory and I'm continuing to do in the wake of the book, The Implicated Subject, about this sense of like feeling implicated in history. I think shame and guilt are affects that, that mark a kind of a feeling of implication. And, in The Implicated Subject, I was somewhat skeptical about the productivity of those particular emotions and affects, especially guilt, because I feel like guilt is can be a kind of confusing, it's a kind of confusing concept because it refers on the one hand to a kind of legal register of criminal guilt, let's say, and then to an emotion, right, a feeling of guilt. And I think that the confusion between those two, and I think something similar may go for shame as well, can create a kind of defensiveness and a kind of resentment, right? That people feel they are being accused of things that they did not do themselves. And so I guess I'm sort of trying to open up my thinking about shame and guilt, stimulated partly by various colleagues and students who I'm working with on some of these topics, and to think about the potential productivity as well as the defensiveness that can emerge from them. But for me, I mean, I think it's really it's a really central question, is how we process those kinds of negative affects and turn them into, for me, the important term is solidarity, feelings of solidarity, right? Which allow us to link up across different experiences and different subject positions. But I don't have a really specific answer for how shame in particular operates there. Maybe Alison has a thought about that.
I would just add that I think that unpleasant affects can be productive, and I think that when we are made to sort of question what we thought we knew about ourselves or our place in the world, that can produce shame. But that feeling of uncomfortableness, I think, can be constructive. I mean, it's not always constructive. One doesn't want to have it sort of foster like a feeling of victimization, right? I mean, which is the danger. But I mean, one of the reasons that I'm interested in mass culture and mass cultural narratives is that they really do have the capacity to try to structure the way that one encounters a particular past, the position that one is being asked to occupy, so that a narrative sort of places you, a televisual or filmic narrative places you within a narrative, puts you in a particular relationship to an unfolding series of events that might produce an experience of shame, right? When one thinks about what one saw or felt. And for me, the original, in the original formulation of prosthetic memory, I was very interested in the way that those negative affects, those the sort of encounters with other people's experiences might actually produce empathy, make possible alliances, the kind of alliances that Michael's describing across chasms of difference, right? To find, to forge those connections where it might have been impossible to see them before.
So moving on, and we have a ton of wonderful questions. Keep them coming. We probably won't, unfortunately, get to all of them, but this is producing really wonderful further conversation. So from Esperanza Roman Mendoza, and I think this may get us back to Susan Nyman, Michael. They ask, what about the GDR? Could you explain how different memories were influencing each other there before 1989? How is the process of reconciliation of memory culture between both Germanys after unification? And that also, I would be happy to jump in at some point.
Okay, yeah, I might a bit
as well.
Yeah, I might turn that over to you, Sam, because I'm by no means an expert on the GDR, but I think it's obviously an important question, and yeah, I mean, so I'll refer first to Susan Nyman, even though I think her perspective is precisely not the normative perspective on GDR memory, but in her book, Learning from the Germans, which I do think is an excellent book, she has a very provocative chapter that argues that, in fact, East Germany more seriously grappled and earlier grappled with the Nazi past than West Germany did, which is really not the usual way that these issues are talked about. And usually East Germany is talked about as having this kind of official anti-fascist culture, which was very top-down, in some ways inauthentic, and not at all really geared toward remembrance of the Holocaust as such. And Nyman makes what, for me at least, was a pretty, as a non-specialist, was a pretty convincing argument that this memory, East German memory, should be taken more seriously, and that there was really more serious grappling with National Socialism and even the Holocaust early on than there was in West Germany, and that that jives a bit with some work by a former colleague of mine, Anke Pinkert, who's a film scholar, who wrote a book about East German films and the Nazi past and the Holocaust, arguing that in fact there's a lot more there than had been talked about before. So I do think that that's a story that's being re-narrated and revised in interesting and productive ways. Again, I leave it to people who are more expert to kind of negotiate those arguments. I would say that I think the legacies of the GDR play a really important role in the discussions today, insofar as this moment of unification was a kind of moment of renationalization, right? Of bringing back together this society that had been divided. And that Holocaust memory was one of the ways that that happened, right? It was used to construct a kind of national memory and a national identity. And what happened at that moment was a lot of people who didn't fit into the ethnic notion of what a German was or should be started to feel the effects of that nationalization. So that's precisely the moment when you get neo-Nazi violence across Germany in the early 1990s, the firebombing of refugee hostels, of homes with immigrants, Turkish Germans and others. You get a great deal of violence and death coming from the far right. And that is one of the effects of this moment of renationalization. I'm not saying that's an effect of Holocaust memory, but it's that moment at which Holocaust memory kind of emerged to unify as a unifying factor, which in some ways, and here's part of the argument that Yasemin Yildiz and I make in our project on migration and memory, Holocaust memory came to reconfirm a certain ethnic German identity, right? Who was a German? A German was the one who traced their ancestry back to the Nazi period and is now atoning for that and taking responsibility for it. That atonement and responsibility is great, but if your parents emigrated from Turkey in the 1960s or early 1970s, where do you fit into that story, right? How can you be German in that context where German identity is so strictly connected to a certain inheritance of a particular history? It gets complicated.
No, I mean, that's a wonderful answer. I certainly read Nyman's book with a little bit more skepticism, and I think part of it has to do, I think we can actually make out a similar process happening in East Germany as what you've laid out as sort of happening in German memory culture writ large, of early on, a lot of discussion, a lot of conversation in the immediate post-war years, certainly much greater prosecutions of Nazi perpetrators after the war in East Germany than in what became West Germany. On the other hand, that then sort of ossifies in later decades into this much more rigid sort of anti-fascist view or version of the Holocaust, where notoriously Jews, the suffering of the Jews is sort of downplayed in the GDR, especially in later decades. And in my own research on queerness, this is a big issue that the GDR regime is very reluctant to acknowledge that queer people were victims of the Holocaust. So, I think Nyman is certainly onto something in making out a more complex view of the GDR, but I think isn't quite right necessarily holding it up as a model. So from Natalia Dudnik here at Mason, I was wondering which subject positions besides victim or perpetrator multidirectional memory cultures might produce. And I think that's probably for both Michael and Alison.
I mean, I'll take that up to begin with, because in a way, again, that's the focus of my follow-up book to multidirectional memory, the implicated subject. And what I became interested in after I finished multidirectional memory was precisely like, how do people who aren't victims, how are histories shared across experiences that don't necessarily pass through victimization, right? So a lot of the examples in multidirectional memory, the Du Bois one, for example, that Alison mentioned, had to do with members of different, let's say, victim groups. Again, I don't love this language, but just for simplification here, how these experiences could be shared. So Du Bois goes to Warsaw, sees evidence of genocide, of mass racial violence, and it causes him to rethink his own experience as an African American and what he has been through and what African Americans have been through, in such a way that he holds on to a kind of, I would say, a differentiated relationality, right, where he doesn't, in fact, collapse African American and Jewish European experiences together, but sees how they're on a kind of continuum of racial violence, right? So in multidirectional memory, I was really especially interested in that sort of victim to victim solidarity. But I became interested in, yeah, precisely as the question asked, what about other subject positions? And, you know, the first essay that I think I wrote after, one of the first, maybe first or second essay that I wrote after finishing the book was an essay on V.G. Sebald, the novelist, and William Kentridge, the Jewish South African artist. And if you know either of their works, you'll know that in some ways they're very multi-directional, right? Sebald brings together all sorts of different histories. Kentridge does something similar in the South African context, but they do it not so much from the position of the victim, but from the position of the implicated subject, right? So for Sebald, the person born German after the Holocaust or at the very end of the war, what kind of responsibility does he bear? And I see his work as about that question. Kentridge, you know, can trace back his ancestry to Eastern European Jews, but in South Africa, he is white and benefits from the privileges of being white. So when he brings together Holocaust memory and the memory of slavery and the memory of apartheid, he does it not strictly speaking from the position of the victim, but from the position of someone who's in fact implicated in and benefiting from a different form of racial violence. So I think that's, for me, that was a really important shift to try to open up these categories a bit. Maybe Alison has some, yeah.
I would only add that, I mean, one of the things I tried to articulate in prosthetic memory by calling it prosthetic was that one was aware that it wasn't actually your memory, right? That it wasn't natural in some sense, right? That these memories, yes, we might feel like we have an affective connection to another person's history, but there was no confusion that it was your own experience, right? And so like I was interested in the metaphor of the prosthesis because, you know, it's artificial, but it's useful, right? You incorporate it into your body, but it's not naturalized. You know, it's still, you know, it's artificial to a certain extent, but serves a purpose. And so I think, I mean, I was trying to sort of use that as a way to talk about how we might develop these alliances, right? That we're not sort of simply feeling, you know, guilty or feeling victimized, but like having one's own perspective changed by an encounter with somebody else's past that changes the way one understands one's own position and recognizes the way that one might share commitments and convictions with people who are in some ways quite different.
Right. And no, I think to me, I'll just say, just to reaffirm that, I think that's really, really important. And I think, of course, that's not always what happens, right? Sometimes people do collapse their own memories or appropriate, let's say, the memories of others. But I agree with Alison that the most productive forms of this kind of, let's say, transcultural memory work are ones that preserve moments of difference. Right. And so I was interested, for example, in the implicated subject around the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, where you went from a rhetoric, and I talk about the Trayvon Martin case there, especially after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, how a first gesture is to say, like, we are all Trayvon Martin. In some ways, that's an important political gesture and a very common one, right? We are all this, we are all that. And yet at the same time, it erases certain differences, right? I am not Trayvon Martin. There's no way that I share in those experiences. And I was intrigued by this social media project that arose up after that in response to that kind of rhetoric called We Are Not Trayvon Martin. And the idea was not to distance, you know, themselves from what had happened, but to say, look, we are responding to racist violence, not from the position of the victims of that violence necessarily, but again, as what I would call implicated subjects, right? As people who have material links and empathy and solidarity, but in such a way that it remains, as you would say, Alison, kind of prosthetic and differentiated. And to me, that's a really important, you know, issue for social and political movements, I suppose.
An anonymous attendee asked, Americans are now very familiar with the horrors of the Holocaust, and Germans are familiar with the violence of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States. But I wonder how German culture's curious fascination with Native Americans might enter into this discussion. And I just sort of tacking on to that, and you already touched on this a bit, Michael, but it's interesting how I think we can see a similar process in terms of how the Holocaust is remembered in the United States. And I guess I'm thinking in particular about the debate in 2019 over border policies and how AOC Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made an explicit comparison to Nazi concentration camps, and in response, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, issued a letter saying that it was, that one could not compare the Holocaust to any other events, and in response, many historians, myself included, signed a letter saying that, the comparison is the lifeblood of sort of Holocaust historiography. So anyway, I guess what I find really interesting about this question is the way in which memory and history from other national contexts in Germany and the US are sort of metabolized or made productive.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I also signed that letter to the Holocaust Museum, of course. We do live in a globalized world in which histories, certainly, and memories certainly transcend borders in all sorts of ways, not equally, evenly, obviously. It's also a very uneven world, for sure. But it just seems impossible to grapple with any of these issues in a non-transnational framework. I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter, explosions in 2020, it obviously goes further back than that, but what happened in 2020, as we all know, was quickly became globalized in a really interesting way. And of course, as it touches down in every different national context, Britain, France, Germany, wherever, it's going to mean different things, take on different meanings, and different things are going to be worked out, of course, in those different contexts. I think that the original question has to do with the sort of fascination with Native Americans, American Indians in Germany. And I don't know a lot about that, I have to admit. Maybe Sam, you would want to say more about that. And it's certainly a well-known phenomena. And it's a little bit of a strange phenomena, if I could say so myself, looking at it at least from outside. And it does, Germans are not unique in this kind of thing, but there is a kind of whiff of appropriation, of cultural appropriation there going on. And so, but I'm not, I can't really weigh in specifically on that, except to say that I think sometimes we do reach beyond our borders for other examples that can kind of exonerate us, if you know what I mean. So it can be part of a kind of defensiveness, like you talk about anti-Semitism in Germany, and someone says, yes, but what about racism in the United States? And I would say, yeah, of course, absolutely, that is true. And so we need to be able to talk about these things in comparative and relational terms without instrumentalizing them. And, the German word is Entlastung. The English word is like, letting ourselves off the hook or something like that. And I think to me, that's a really important criterion, is like when we reach across borders, when we remember other histories, when we make alliances, are we doing it in a way to let ourselves off the hook? There's probably a better term for that, or to kind of expand the scope of responsibility that we have, or cultural knowledge, or whatever it is. It doesn't always have to be about responsibility either. So yeah, but there are definitely tricky questions of cross-cultural comparison, appropriation, linkage, etc.
I would only add that, in the US context, I mean, there was a great deal of discussion about that when the Holocaust Museum opened in 1993, before the Museum of the American Indian, before any sort of any museum for African American history and culture, right? And so there was a sense that this was easy for Americans to rally around, because it wasn't our genocide, right? So we could all sort of get behind a Holocaust museum in a way that really blocked, I think. I mean, the negative way of saying it is it really blocked critical attention to the genocides and racial violence that were sort of perpetrated here. I mean, I tried to sort of argue in prosthetic memory that it might produce, the memorial culture of the Holocaust might produce a vocabulary that would be useful here. But the larger point clearly is that it was a way of not looking at, what happened here.
And that's also what I was trying to challenge in multidirectional memory. And that really is the moment out of which multidirectional memory emerged. And it's a difficult question because, again, these histories are not equally represented in the public sphere. And I think it's absolutely true that, the United States has not come to terms with its own forms of racial violence and genocide and enslavement in the way that it should. And that continues to be the case. But I guess I was skeptical then, and I'm still somewhat skeptical now, that it's because of the prominence of Holocaust memory that we haven't grappled with those things, right? Because it's not like before the Holocaust Museum, we were doing such a great job at confronting those histories either. And so even though I'm, maybe not as optimistic as I once was, and I think both of our work has been, sometimes pejoratively, sometimes maybe in positive ways has been talked about as optimistic, I'm maybe not quite as optimistic as I was when I started. But I'm still believe that that actually memories trigger each other in a good way, right? That memory of the Holocaust has produced more grappling with the history of slavery and American Indian genocide than not. And I think that's actually, to go back to the German context, I actually think that's happening there too. So even though I'm sometimes portrayed as saying that I think Holocaust memory in Germany is blocking these other memories, that's not really precisely my argument at all. I think people are trying to use it sometimes to block other memories, but I don't think if you look at the larger context, that's actually what's happening. And I think that, we've been talking in the German context a lot more about colonialism since we've started these debates in the last 2 years, perhaps than we were before. I mean, it was certainly happening also before, and there are all sorts of grassroots actors making that possible. But I don't think this discussion of the Holocaust uniqueness that has reemerged in the last 18 months in Germany has prevented the articulation of other histories and memories. I think it's actually in some ways made them more central to the discussion. Still, again, in unsatisfactory ways most of the time, but there are some indications, perhaps small ones, and maybe again, I'm being overly optimistic, that there may be shifts taking place. So I actually, I actually continue to see productive relationships across these different memories, even as I'm also attentive to the hierarchies and the forms of exclusion that get reproduced again and again. And that's certainly true.
I mean, I would agree with you. I mean, I think that, the practice, the habits of memorialization, right, of thinking about responsibility, I think, can be useful and certainly are translatable from one instance to another.
I would just add that within specifically sort of Holocaust historiography, there's been a new sort of more recent interest in sort of American connections with the Nazi regime and the Holocaust, specifically the ways in which the Nazis looked to the United States as a model for the extermination of Jews and other minority groups, right? They look to the genocide of Native peoples in the Americas as a model for what they might do in Eastern Europe. They look to laws in the Jim Crow South as models for the infamous 1935 Nuremberg laws. And so I think that is another example of how, maybe in a bit more of a scholarly context, but also in, I think, popular imagination and memory, the American interest in the Holocaust has actually been productive in spurring conversations about the genocide of Native Americans and slavery and Jim Crow and so forth.
Right. And again, so if I could just one quick response to that, I mean, this is part of what's so baffling to me about the German response, or parts of the German response to my book, is like, there are these historical connections to point out that the Nazis drew on American race and miscegenation and immigration law when they were crafting the Nuremberg laws, doesn't relativize the Holocaust or in some way take away from the Holocaust. It enriches our understanding of what was going on. And I just feel like we should be able to make these kinds of connections and sometimes comparisons and even analogies without having to worry that we're going to be accused of relativization and this sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is more of a sort of theoretical question from Elke Heckner. I wonder whether Alison, in talking about Benjamin's approach, in parentheses, dialectical image, and temporalities of the past and present, might also want to recognize the potentially important role of belatedness. How would this work in the context of keeping the legacy of slavery solely in the past?
That's a really interesting question, and I would like to hear. Can we ask for further elaboration on belatedness?
Well, perhaps if Elke is still in the audience, we can ask them to post a follow-up, and in the meantime, I can pose another question. There was a really interesting question from Ian Sinnott that I think is actually somewhat related. It's also sort of theoretically about how memory works today. In the age of streaming media, do you think a mass-mediated experience like the viewing of Roots or the Holocaust miniseries is still possible today? How might a comparable experience occur today?
I'll let Alison go take that one. I think it's a good question.
Yeah, I think that obviously we live in a different sort of media environment now than we did when both of those miniseries aired. I mean, it was possible for there to be like a media event that was kind of happening simultaneously, right? Like across Germany or across the US. And so everybody was watching it at the same time. So I don't think that really there is the potential so much for that. However, I think that that sort of what the sort of digital environment, the digital platforms have meant is that certain shows, films have a kind of international traction or audience. So it becomes, more possible for more people across national boundaries to watch a particular text, and so I think, it sort of moves in both directions. I think, the sort of media event aspect, I think, is no longer possible, but the idea that people, in Norway and in United States and in South Africa, might be watching the same television show or film, right, might mean that it's that there's a possibility for a kind of intellectual public sphere to develop that's around a particular issue that's not sort of nationally specific.
I think that's, I think that's a really good point. And I'm not a media theorist or scholar, so, I can't necessarily speak with great authority about some of those shifts. So I think we all live those shifts every day. So we have a certain familiarity with them. But I think that point about the fact that the media events today, and I would say the media debates today, like the ones we've been talking about, are no longer so easily cordon-offable into national spheres. And a really interesting point of comparison then would be, the historikerstreit of the 1980s, the historians' debate, which we haven't talked about so much, though it's one of the things kind of standing behind a lot of what we're talking about, right? This debate precisely about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, in which Jürgen Habermas made a very important point precisely about the specificity of the Holocaust and the importance of recognizing it in Germany. And that was at the time clearly a progressive move. And in a sense, Habermas won the debate, and that became enshrined in German national memory. And, again, that had mostly good effects, and now it's having some more complicated effects, some problematic effects that I've been talking about. But what's interesting is that the debate that's been going on over the last 18 months has sometimes been called the Historikerstreit 2.0, right? The second historians' debate. And what's interesting about it is it's no longer constrained to the national context as the first one was. I mean, certainly people read about it elsewhere, but all of the major players in the first historians' debate of the 1980s were German. In fact, they were all German men of a certain generation, basically. And the debate today is at least more international, somewhat more diverse, still dominated too much perhaps by men, I think you could say. But, it was, the first stimulus was, again, Achille Mbembe's work. The second stimulus was my book translation. The third stimulus was an essay by Dirk Moses, an Australian historian based in the US, called The German Catechism. So the impetus for a lot of these debates is coming from outside of Germany. And a lot of the participants in it are coming from different locations. And so I don't know if that's strictly ascribable to changes in the media environment, but I do think those enable those kinds of shifts because we are networked across borders in a different way.
And interestingly, in terms of the so-called catechism debate, some of the most, I think, interesting and thoughtful contributions have come from, or at least been published outside of Germany, right? There's the New Fascism syllabus that Jennifer Evans, among others, edits and put together this wonderful series of responses to Dirk Moses. There's Geschichte der Gegenwart, which is based in Switzerland. And so you have
which published the German Catechism initially.
Right, exactly. After, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe after a German journal had sort of dilly-dallied and ultimately refused to publish it. And
they didn't refuse to publish it, but they did dilly-dally, to use the technical term.
And so, so I think that's completely correct that there aren't these sort of national boundaries, even though, of course, the debate is also going on in Germany, although there it's oftentimes in the sort of feuilletons, and it's not always, I mean, sometimes those are very valuable contributions, but I think also sometimes those aren't the most interesting or thoughtful responses to these questions. We have a follow-up from Elke Heckner about belatedness. So hang on, the original question was, I wonder whether Alison, in talking about Benjamin's approach, dialectical image, and temporalities of the past and present, might also want to recognize the potentially important role of belatedness. How would this work in the context of keeping the legacy of slavery solely in the past? And then the follow-up is two follow-ups. Belatedness seems to allow inconvenient memories of the past to emerge belatedly with a time lag and emerge in the present after a long period of latency. It strikes me that your project of drawing on memories of traumatic histories into the present seems to speed up the demand that memories need to be presenced rather than relegated to the past. In other words, belatedness seems relevant to an insistence of history to not pass into the past, but insist on the presencing of history and memory. And then they also added, belatedness allows for critical insight after the fact, so to speak.
I absolutely love that. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I wasn't familiar with this concept of belatedness, but as you articulate it, I totally see what you're saying and it makes sense. And I do think that's precisely what I'm trying to get at with the way that the dialectical images work, that those memories are surfaced, they are brought into the present, they are brought into relationship with the present, to reframe the present, to defamiliarize the present so that we see it differently. So I think that's a lovely way of articulating what I'm trying to suggest.
And I'll just say, I mean, for me, that's precisely why I'm interested in memory as a phenomena and why it's been such a productive category for me when I finally kind of discovered it, is because memory, as opposed to history, and this is not, discounting of the importance of history, but memory is always about the link between past and present, right? It's always a constellation. It's always a dialectical image, if you want to use that kind of vocabulary. And certainly Benjamin has been important for me as well. So it's precisely that conjuncture, that bringing together, it's of different things, different moments in time, and almost inevitably also different places, that makes it such a fascinating phenomena. And yeah, so I don't know if Elke's mean, by belatedness, that's sometimes used as a translation of Nachträglichkeit. So I'm not sure if that's, coming out of a psychoanalytic vocabulary or après coup in French. Anyway, yeah, fascinating.
So we're almost out of time. I think we have time for one sort of brief go around, although the question I think isn't, we could talk for another hour about this, but from Eric Ross, what is the role of more formal modes of public memory work in Germany and elsewhere, specifically memorials, museums, and so forth, as compared to less formal modes like mass culture, texts, and so on? Is there something that German memorials and museums do differently? You, Michael, briefly mentioned the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe earlier, and he's hoping that you can elaborate more. And I think, Alison, you would also have a lot to say about sort of memorials and museums in the US.
Yeah, very, I think that is a really important question. And it is a huge question. And I think maybe one that's not so easily answered briefly or definitively, because I think there are a lot of different ways to approach it. I mean, I think what you see, let's stick to Germany for the moment, is a complicated landscape of memory, I guess I would say, in which various factors are at play, from grassroots initiatives. We talked about the 80s and Holocaust initiatives, but today the analogy is in fact, initiatives having to do with memory of colonialism and other forms of racism. So street renamings, right? A big struggle has been going on. So interventions into public space coming from below, but also seeking some sort of official recognition. So I think there's a lot of interplay between different levels, and that's what's productive about memory culture, I think, precisely when you have interplay between a sort of civil society grassroots level and then a state level. And I think what's happened is, and I think Dirk Moses is making a similar point, is that the balance has shifted a bit too much toward the state-oriented forms of memory, and that there's a need for a kind of reinvigoration from below. But again, I do think that some of this is starting to reach into those more official spaces. So in terms of museums, right, the big controversy in Germany, or another big controversy in Germany, has been about the Humboldt Forum. That's probably too long a story to get into now, but it just opened with a kind of ethnological collection, which includes works that have been looted from colonial contexts. And it's hugely controversial, rightly so. But at the opening of that event just a few weeks ago, there was a pretty interesting and pretty open, I thought, talk by the president of Germany, Steinmeier, not the chancellor, but the president, as well as an incredibly powerful talk by the writer Chimamanda Adichie, calling for restitution, right? And really confronting in front of the president, in front of all of these luminaries in this state institution, calling very clearly for restitution of that which has been stolen, for real confrontation with colonial history. So I think things are bubbling up from below and taking place at the intersection of a lot of different realms of memory.
Thank you. Alison, do you want to add any brief thoughts? Or
I mean, Eric knows what I have to say about the Legacy Museum, but I think that it's an example of a museum that is very much a memory museum, a museum that is about the present, that is constructing a dialectical image by beginning with the warehousing of enslaved people, right? The museum is set at a site where Africans were warehoused, and it ends with mass incarceration, with enslaved, incarcerated African-American bodies in the present. And we're asked to sort of see this as a dialectical image instead of, and the argument is very explicitly at the museum, not about evolution or a linear narrative of progress, but it's very much about the continuities between the past and the present. So I think, and so I see that happening in the arena of mass culture and those kinds of arguments, and also in some interesting work that's being done in museums as well.
Thank you. So I think that's a really wonderful place to leave it. We're exactly at 3:30 Eastern time. Thank you both, Michael and Alison, for a really stimulating conversation. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to listen and for all of the wonderful questions. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to all of them, but I think this has been a really fascinating conversation, and one that obviously will continue for days and months and years to come. So thank you both. Thank you, everyone else.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Michael. It was great.
Enjoyed it.